All right, so it is 11 Central European time, and we better get started. So I would like to welcome everybody to session 3, Stakeholder Engagement for an Inclusive LTES Development Process. Now, this session focuses on how countries engage different kinds of stakeholders in the development of scenarios to ensure overall that the clean energy transition is a just and inclusive one. As the energy transition unfolds, studies both by IRENA and other organizations indicate that globally there are significant socioeconomic benefits to be gained through the energy transition, whether we measure that in terms of GDP, in terms of jobs, human well-being. So our work, for example, at IRENA indicates that from a present level of renewable energy employment of 11 million worldwide, by 2050 we may see as many as 42 million jobs. But it's also clear, let me emphasize, that while the overall picture on the global level is very positive, not every region or every country is able to take full advantage of these opportunities the transition offers, at least not under current policies and assumptions. In fact, some countries and communities face much more of a challenge, and I think very important to mention here are oil exporters, coal-dependent areas, but also countries and economies that generally are not well diversified economically and which often lack strong domestic supply chains. So I think we face the prospect of not just winners, but also potential losers in this transition. We can think of the potential for misalignments in the labor markets. So while we have job gain, we also have job loss, and sometimes the job gains and the job losses don't add up in terms of the how quickly this happens or when this happens, in what particular locations, or what particular sectoral aspects of the economy are concerned, and what skills and occupations will gain or will lose the most. So there are certain misalignments that I think need to be studied closely and which need to inform the policy making. Overall, I think there's more and more recognition now that there is a very strong need for a just transition strategy that leaves no one behind. At IRENA, our work addresses the policy package that is needed to maximize the benefits and minimize the burdens, the adjustment burdens. And I think it's quite clear that these will need to be tailored to specific national or local contexts. So we're talking about economic development and industrial policies, education and skills, labor markets, interventions and social protection measures, various kinds of financial policies. But it's also clear that beyond the socioeconomic dimension of the transition, there are sort of a set of what could be called political issues, particularly around the issue of acceptance of, of energy policy decision making. And then I think in all of these contexts, it's really critical to identify and engage with the different sets of stakeholders that are most relevant in this regard. So, of course, different levels of governmental authorities, the private sector, labor groups, community representatives, and citizens groups, and many, many others. So with this very quick, broad introduction, let me turn now to our presenters. We have 3 presenters. I'll introduce each one at a turn. I would like to remind them that we want to keep the presentations to 10 minutes, so we have time for discussion afterwards. So let's get started with our first presenter, Dennis Volk, who is the team lead for network infrastructure development at the Bundesnetzagentur, which is the German federal regulatory agency for networks. And so Dennis, go ahead. You have the floor, as it were.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Good day to everybody listening in. So without further ado, the German energy regulators tasked basically to make policy targets happen on the ground. We regulate the gas and the electricity industry, and notably the grid services in distribution and transmission, but also in these days we run the auctions for renewables deployment in Germany. And the interesting part is that we, as a regulator, we sit between the policy level and the targets, investors on the ground, but also the stakeholders, including the public. It's an interesting position in a sense that it is the position where you see directly if and how long-term energy policy scenarios can actually be translated into practical action on the ground. So our decisions as a regulator, they are binding, and they also directly translate into economic consequences, including the investments. As a regulator, we strive to take those decisions which obviously serve all market participants while maximizing or trying to maximize the benefits to the society and the entire economy. For achieving all that, stakeholder engagement is a key ingredient for us in order to prepare decisions, to take those decisions, to communicate decisions, to evaluate them, but also to revise those decisions when needed. So you could actually say for regulators, stakeholders engagement is part of our regulatory DNA. All decisions therefore include engagement in one form or the other. So I will use the next couple of minutes to introduce one of our prime regulatory processes and talk a little bit about how stakeholder engagement is represented in that process, and also maybe at the end to talk a little bit about one possible limitation to that process. So next slide, please, Mike. So what you look here is a brief overview of the German electricity transmission planning process as it stands right now. Because of the energy transition, the Energiewende, we see a major need to restructure and rebuild the existing transmission lines in Germany, which comes at a significant cost to the economy, but also to the society. This process has been put in place to ensure the build-out is being made transparent, it's being made under heavy consultation, that there's a lot of scrutiny to be put into that process, and that in the end you have seamless regulatory approvals to build these transmission lines and also to roll the additional costs and investments into the regulated asset base, and also to make sure that what is in the plan is actually being built, so we have powers to enforce the plans as well. All in all, at the moment, as we plan, this process facilitates around 90 billion euros of investments in transmission infrastructure, electricity alone in Germany up until 2030, and it's likely that there's more to come in the future. This process already shows us that it's possible to allow or achieve a timely implementation of infrastructure development, mobilizing investment, but also creating wider stakeholder buy-in and acceptance, which is a very important factor, because without that acceptance on the ground, either you run the risk of being delayed with your build-out, or you can't achieve your targets at all. So coming back to that picture, you see a 5-step process which is defined by law, which is a very important aspect to note here as well, because it's the law, the legal framework, which makes us or empowers us as a regulator to take on that critical role in the stakeholder engagement part. It's also for the stakeholders themselves a very important factor, because it clearly shows them what they can expect from that process, how they can bring themselves into that process, so how they make themselves heard, and what happens to the input they put in. So this overall transmission approval process is repeated every 2 years and starts with a determination of long-term electricity sector scenarios, which is the step 1 in the graph. In short, I'm not going to talk about the scenarios today, but happy to support or provide them later on. These scenarios, we improve the required transmission infrastructure needed to resolve bottlenecks in the existing transmission grid we see coming up. So this is the step 2 of that graph, where we approve based on load flow models and dynamic stability assessment for the German electricity system. For these 2 steps, we apply a time horizon for 10 to 15 years in our scenarios, which is basically aligned with the lead time for the initial planning and commissioning of the transmission lines. And it is within these two first steps where we have all in all 3 different stakeholder consultation processes happening, which allow us to engage with the communities and political decision makers, but also which allows us to learn. And what we have learned, I show you on the next slide. So this is just 2 examples of what we have learned in the stakeholder process. 2 small examples, but there's many more. And why stakeholder engagement is so important for us when we develop and approve long-term scenarios and also the investments associated to it. So on the left-hand side, you see 2 graphs related to our models to localize the future wind generation resources, which is a very important aspect when you talk about transmission planning, because you exactly need to know where your resources will be located. In the German system, we run a model with around 450 nodes for those technicians amongst us who are interested in those details. So what we've learned in this context for wind resource location is that the results of our models are obviously, and that's the very left part of that graph, are obviously influenced by the wind regime. So basically, we're talking economics, and we apply models which are fairly standard in that regard. At the same time, we have also come to realize that it's very important for us to also include the local political and social circumstances on the ground, including, for example, rules for distancing. And we have realized that we needed to feed our models with this additional data, which comes from the bottom up to us in an effort across entire Germany. So to identify in local circumstances where we can actually build out wind in the future and how likely it is we're going to see in specific locations on the ground wind generation resources to emerge. So as a result, I can say with this stakeholder engagement, we've been able to identify the right locational choices for wind as they are going to be likely to happen. And this inclusion on top of the economic evaluation has definitely had an impact and altered already the outcomes of our scenario assessments and our transmission network build-out assessments. That's the one side. And on the right-hand side, what you see here is a region within the southern part of Germany in which we propose to build out a small 150 kilometers new additional transmission line between 2 fixed entry and exit points. And we've run several consultation processes over time over the last 5 years, basically, which allowed us to engage with local and regional decision makers, the industry and the society on the ground, to identify potential modifications in the transmission line routing. So this feedback allowed us not only to discuss the specific benefits and costs associated with these transmission lines, but also the options we had at hand. And through this process, we also were able to finally arrive at an acceptable decisions, which is likely to be implemented in the future. So these are just...
Dennis, 2 minutes?
Yeah, please.
No, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, fine. I'll be quick. What these 2 examples show basically is that without the stakeholder engagement, your scenarios and investment plans are much more prone to errors and way less likely to be implemented in time or at all. So which leads us to the next slide, please. If it's hard to generalize what are the key success factors for stakeholder engagement, because each jurisdiction is different, has its own requirements, and even each process is different and requires different rules of engagement. But on a higher level, I guess a clear mandate is very important for all stakeholders to understand the process and know their roles. And for us, in this specific context, the legal framework helped, but it could be also done through other things. Transparency within this engagement process is a very important factor as well. Also, transparency about what happens to the input stakeholders putting in and how decisions are being made. very important also is that the final decisions cannot simply be discarded, so that you can follow what has happened to the input you have made. One of the aspects I wanted to talk about a little bit further, but in interest of time, I limited to just saying it's out there and it's a very important factor for us, is the decision making under uncertainty. So how do you, based on a variety of scenarios, identify that scenario which gives you the investment portfolio you're willing to put your money on? That's a very important factor, and clarity and consultation about that is very important, basically. Maybe to the next and last slide. Above and beyond the grid, because it's we understand the grid is just a very small fraction of the energy sector, and we're well aware of this. We can see that there's a growing amount of questions in our small space for building transmission, which we just can't respond to because they are energy policy questions in Germany. And for example, we face questions on why don't we just build the renewables where the grid already is, etc. So these are all policy relevant questions we can't really address. And we see with the emergence or the further development of the Energiewende, including the emergence of merchant renewables, shift in flexibilities, pathways for sector coupling, deeper decarbonization, the role of natural gas, global markets and their impacts and their dynamics, job creation, reallocation of wealth. We see all those questions emerging even further with the ongoing Energiewende, and obviously the regulator is not the right place to discuss all these aspects. So we see that there may be a role for a more system-wide energy plan emerging also in the German context, where these questions in an open manner, based also on consultation, can be addressed. And to the right-hand side, you see that we have already taken some of these steps with regard to the coal phase-out. The German government has decided last year, which was also built on a very transparent process, which arrived at a consensus between the many stakeholders in a lot of aspects of the society and the economy, which actually also reach beyond the electricity and the energy space. So in the interest of time, I think I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for what sounds like a very interesting presentation about a very structured approach to these kinds of decision-making processes. I think I'll probably turn from one speaker to the next pretty quickly in the interest of time, but what might be interesting maybe after everybody has presented to talk about a bit more is this issue of how does acceptance play out in terms of the different stakeholders from the federal level to the state to the community level. And to what extent might there be some lessons learned in Germany that are of interest and are applicable elsewhere? But let's keep that for after the presentation. So let's turn now to our second presenter, Ivetta Gerasimchuk, who is the lead for sustainable energy supplies at IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Ivetta, you have the floor, and as was the case with Dennis, try to stick pretty much to the 10 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll do my best. And greetings to everyone on the line. So IISD is a policy think tank established in Canada 30 years ago. We work a lot with different governments, and we provide also lessons learned and case studies of what has worked in different contexts. So part of my presentation today is going to be based on our publication from last year, and has the same title, Real People, Real Change, Strategies for Just Energy Transitions. Next slide, please. So for people who probably haven't heard the term just transitions, it's a notion that is used by the ILO, and I'm sure Marek will speak about it after me, but also is referenced in the preamble of the Paris Agreement as an imperative for meeting climate targets. And just transition is a set of principles. So it really and the implementation of this set of principles really depends on national context and local context even more. The presentation will focus on elements of these just energy transitions in plural from different countries, but I don't want to make you think that these are the blueprints. Like, really, it's an ideal that we're trying to achieve, and some countries have done better than others, and that's how we can discuss from experience what we think is good practice. We have come up with this framework about 4 C's to enable just transitions. So first, as I said, it's important to see the context, and very often it's local context. You need to work with different stakeholders and identify champions for the agenda of clean energy transition. You need to make the case, so that the third C, and social dialogue is paramount in this respect. So C also involves communications. Of course, it's all about transparency, as also Dennis said in his presentation. It's very important. And the 4th C in our framework was complementary policies. So all the measures that can mitigate the negative impacts on consumers, on workers, on communities, and these measures, of course, require additional funding. So unfortunately now we have this 5th C, which is coronavirus. So, and I'll try to mention our initial ideas for this in the following slides. Next slide, please. So I'll talk to country examples, and one example I have here is from Indonesia, where we have been working for more than 10 years. The reference here is Indonesia's fossil fuel subsidy reform from 2014 and 2015. So while it was a while ago, it's relevant because it was the same moment of low oil prices. So what happened then was that using this shrinkage of the margin between domestic prices and international prices, the government decided to phase out fossil fuel subsidies to consumers. So this has worked because it has been well prepared. There were very clear communications around the objectives of the reform, because it was just inefficient and a very heavy burden on the government's budget, but it also was resulting in wasteful consumption, and consumers from rich households, those who drive more, have been reaping most of the benefits from those subsidies. And it was very also clear from that campaign where the government is going to put the savings. So, and in the end, when they reformed subsidies, they used the increase in the budget, the fiscal space, to support infrastructure, to support regions quite a lot, to support some of the social programs. There are still fossil fuel subsidies in Indonesia, for instance, for LPG, but they are more targeted. So that was that moment of low oil prices. And this is what we can say is an element of just transition. Unfortunately, when price then climbed up, some of the subsidies backslided into the system. But now, right now, we have again low oil price. So which means that globally countries will have a lot of more resources. They don't have to cover this gap for those countries who subsidize fossil fuel prices between the world price and the domestic price. And moreover, countries actually should use taxation and start taxing fossil fuels on the consumption side more. And India has just done exactly that. So that's one example on consumers. The next example I have is from Canada, which is the home of IISD, of my institute, and it speaks to the impacts on workers and communities and the coal phase out. So it's similar to Germany's coal phase out that Dennis referred to. Canada is also one of the founding countries of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and its efforts of consultation have been exemplary in this respect. So there was a task force established, and it was representing not only labor, but also industry, environmental NGOs, academia, and it has consulted with a lot of stakeholders in the affected regions and came up with a report which then informed the federal policy in Canada and informed a lot of other discussions at the provincial level as well, and has also facilitated some of the funding to the affected communities and workers. Next slide. I'm coming back to funding because we work a lot in the energy team on fiscal instruments and on financial flows related to clean energy transitions. So, of course, the question is how you resource the mitigation measures for the affected stakeholders. So I've already mentioned taxation of oil consumption as one way, and it doesn't have to be a carbon tax. Always in developing countries, it's more often excise taxes, or it can be just VAT, whatever generates more fiscal space. But as we move on to carbon pricing, of course, there are opportunities to earmark those revenues. I'm sure there are people online who know much more about the EU ETS than I do, but there was an opportunity provided there to relocate some of the carbon pricing revenues to just transition. There are also opportunities to fund just transitions through taxation of fossil fuel production. For example, in the United States, in the Appalachia, there is a tax on coal for already 2 decades, and it has been used gradually to diversify the economy of those regions. So I mentioned again the idea of swapping savings from fossil fuel subsidy reform, and this is at the high level, like in Indonesia, where you don't subsidize fossil fuels more, and the kind of fiscal space freed up in the budget is used to support low carbon transition and social causes. There are dedicated just transition funds in certain countries. The most notable example is perhaps China. Even though they don't call it a just transition fund, they set up a facility worth $15 billion US for 4 years to support layoffs in the coal and steel sectors. There has been a lot of restructuring, and some of the provinces affected were also involved into dedicated funding for those restructurings. And finally, and this is the 5th C, the coronavirus response. So we have right now an opportunity where governments freed up a lot of funding. Unfortunately, a lot still goes to high carbon assets. But if we have a positive agenda, and that's our job here on this webinar and in other platforms in our organizations to develop this positive agenda, we can propose measures to use the response to COVID crisis to support just transition, and of course other necessary green economic recovery measures. It's important that this support goes to workers, communities, and consumers, because unfortunately, very often when it goes to the banking sector and corporations, we still see a lot of job cuts, regardless of this support. So there can be strings attached. And I hope that in further packages that we see, which will be prepared with a little bit more notice, there will be such strings attached for green energy transitions. There are lessons learned about this from 2008-2009 stimulus packages. For instance, in the United States, there were consultations with the car manufacturing industry, and there were requirements for emissions standards as part of the stimulus and bailout of the industry. And we have the opportunity to reset our development patterns, and it's important to have consultations with all stakeholders for this reason, because only then we'll have a just transition. So that's my final slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivetta, for a very interesting presentation. I think you touched on a lot of really super interesting items that I wish we actually had more than a few minutes to discuss afterwards, but I'm sure there will be follow-up in various ways. I think particularly what you talked about at the end, you know, this notion now of a stimulus response to the coronavirus crisis. I think it picks right up on, as you said, the crisis of 10 years ago, but even before the virus hit, right? I mean, there was increasing discussion again of the idea of a global Green New Deal. So I think there are waves of discussing very similar ideas, and I think ultimately what it comes down to is probably, again, you know, how do we actively and productively engage different stakeholders? How do we make sure that you had talked about the need for champions? You had talked about the use of task forces in different countries. So I think the understanding of what needs to happen, I think, needs to be paired with more of a stakeholder and an institutional capacity analysis, as it were. So thank you very much again. Let's now turn to our third presenter, Marek Horst, who is an economist and green jobs specialist with the Green Jobs program at the International Labour Organization. Marek, you have the floor. Try to, like the other two speakers, to stick to about 10 minutes, and I think we'll be in good shape. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It flows nicely because I'll talk about the engagement of ministries of finance, planning, and ministries of economy. I present to you a macroeconomic model that we developed at the International Labour Organization to help design better renewable energy policies. Let me start with giving you the context. In the next slide. So most world leaders in business as well as in government, they know the climate is an emergency and renewable energies are key. However, most politics are driven by jobs and GDP. Unemployment and inequality is rising, and we will see now in the COVID crisis that this is rising again. The ILO just estimated another 24 million unemployed, similar to the financial crisis. And unfortunately, as was already mentioned by Michael and Ivetta, the stimulus is so far adopted in the US, China, EU, is silent on green. The Democrats in the US, the 2 trillion were passed with anonymous support, being silent on the climate issue. The question is why? And the answer is because the perception is still that jobs and GDP are not related, or in fact are destroyed by renewable energy or climate policies. So what we need is, in the next slide, we need a model, the macroeconomic model, that looks at the renewable energy, the pathways, the long-term pathways, putting those policies into the macroeconomic model and assess what is the impact on jobs, what is the impact on GDP, what is the impact on the broader sustainable development goals, with the objective to maximize job opportunities, minimizing the losses and protect the vulnerable. Just to recall, the US election basically was won on one main aspect being 50,000, which is a very small fraction of the American labor market in coal mining, whereas some estimates point to 3.3 million workers in the clean energy sector in the US. So what we need is to protect the vulnerable and design policies where those that may gain in the transition may transition towards. So we call those, and that was mentioned by Ivetta, the just transition policies. You just click once more. That is a framework that the ILO developed. So in the next slide, I briefly talk about the Green Jobs Assessment Model, which is a macroeconomic model, which has at the forefront the analysis of the social and employment impacts of renewable energy policies. It is based on an input-output framework, which is developed not by the International Labour Organization, but for which Leontiev won the Nobel Prize in the 70s, and which combines the spheres of interest we must look at. That is the socio-economic part, jobs, the direct and indirect jobs. We know it's not only about the direct jobs, but communities in the US are dependent on their income from coal mining and their spending of the income on consumer goods, so that entire regions may completely be dependent. So we must also include the indirect and the induced jobs. The skills are different in the coal mining industries, in the oil and gas industries as compared to in the renewable ones. The gender dimension is different, youth is different impacted, poverty and inequality. As I mentioned, income is impacted by certain renewable energy policies, and we need to assess the quantitative estimates of such a transition. In terms of economics, I had mentioned GDP is of utmost importance, GDP by sector, which influences tax revenues, profits. We know that the fossil fuel industry is highly profitable, obviously depending on the prices and the wages and the distribution of the so-called value added by sector in terms of labor and capital. And then we need to link, if we want to make informed decisions, we need to link these economic indicators to the environment. And that is basically CO2 emissions if we are thinking of climate pathway. Next. So just to give you an example, where we used the model in the ILO flagship publication, World Employment and Social Outlook 2018, we estimated a global climate scenario, how the world, the labor market and the economic transition to a 2-degree world would look like. So in the next slide, you see an aggregate of the world regions, where we see the net 18 million job gains with 24 million jobs created and 6 million jobs lost. As Michael indicated in the very beginning, each and every country and hence region is impacted differently, which points to a very important lesson using these evidence-based macroeconomic models, that under a scenario where economies and structures of economies do not change, look at the Middle East in yellow, if they continue to be reliant on oil and gas, job losses will be felt most in those countries. Other countries in regions such as Europe or Asia, where a lot of technology, wind, solar is produced, they will gain in the transition. So again, the evidence base is important to ministries to see what are the impacts for their local economies to see what countermeasures or policies they may take to counter these effects. In the next slide, we present a methodological guidebook which can help governments, notably ministries of finance, planning and economy, to develop those models. Countries such as Germany, Dennis may know about it, already make use of these type of models. The German institute called GWS develops a model called Panterei for the ministries of finance. So this is a guide more geared towards emerging and developing countries, which may adopt these type of models, because at the global level, obviously, it helps no one. For policy planning purposes, you need to build your own model at country level. So at the ILO, we provide assistance in this methodology for ministries of finance and planning to develop these models in the context of renewable energy policy development, so that eventually certain scenarios may be tested and policies derived as to maximize job opportunities and minimize the losses. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marek. I think you were very close to the allocated time. That's wonderful. Now we have, I think, about almost 20 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is actually try to make sure that we talk as much as possible in the context of the LTES, right, the long-term energy scenarios. And so one question that I think I'd like to have each of you in turn address, and you could then also maybe discuss what you hear from other presenters, you can cross-discuss if you'd like, is how can the LTES process help to plan or mitigate the socio-political and economic impacts of the clean energy transition? You wanna take the lead, Dennis? Your thoughts? Or if you need a moment, actually, I don't see Marek anymore. Ivetta, do you have? Okay. Marek, you can. Yeah, you're back with us, yes?
Yeah, I can just briefly comment. I think yes, what has please. Been said about transparency is very important, and it's important to make the LTES process as transparent as possible. The challenge is, of course, that it's quite technical and technocratic, and it may require an extra level of effort to make it accessible by people who will be affected, and it may require development of extra communication materials. But ultimately, there is unfortunately like this mismatch between technocratic thinking and also the way as we think about climate policies and people, and it's very important to for the people who are affected to be at the center of this conversation, because otherwise, kind of, if this technocratic process comes kind of some conclusion and then suddenly social policies and add on to this, unfortunately, there is very often a pushback, and it's possible to hear from workers that, you know, like just transition is a fancy funeral. I mean, there has been a lot of progress in this conversation over the past 2 years. I think the climate community and the energy technocratic community is much more sensitized now and much more aware of just transition. But still, like there is way to go to build trust with stakeholders, and in this respect, I think LTES is a usual tool as long as it's not like a black box that people don't understand.
Well, thanks very much for these comments, Ivetta. Well taken. What strikes me is that, of course, when we talk about scenario building, when we talk about economic modeling, and these kinds of processes, it revolves around, or it revolves within certain communities, right? People who basically have this kind of knowledge and interest. They have the kind of institutional connections, I suppose. But it's very easy, and I don't mean this as a bad comment in any way, but it's probably very easy for anybody in these processes to sort of lose sight of the world out there, right? So how do we connect up with the real world communities and countries and so on that are impacted by this and that may have particular fears and interests and concerns and preferences? And so the question becomes, to some extent, do we speak the right language, right? How do we translate the language of planning, of modeling, into language that ordinary people who will be affected by this actually understand it? So Dennis, if I can turn to you, in Germany, right? I mean, the Energiewende has a long track record, right? There are many successes, there are some challenges right now, and I understand, if I understand correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong, it seems one of the challenges now, particularly with regard to wind energy development, is the question of siting. Where is it possible to still build a wind farm, right? And I'm wondering, in part, is there a need now to look back at the federal and state relationship? How do communities get brought in? How do citizen initiatives get brought in? Do you have some thoughts for us on this?
Well, yes, it's a very political topic at the moment. I believe the discussions are going on exactly the levels where they belong. That is, namely decision makers on a federal level and also on the regional levels, on the state levels and the local levels. We can see as a public, and I myself as a regulator consider myself as a public in that regard, we can see the discussions emerging, we can see the lines of discussions being exchanged, which is very interesting, but the regulator itself has no say in that. So I can only comment on it from a perspective as the outsider. But it's clear that siting is an important factor right now, which constrains the wind development in Germany, and that we would need to make room for new onshore wind resources, and that we need to find smart ways potentially to engage further local communities as well, potentially maybe even letting them benefit further in one way or the other, so that they get the incentives also to have the windmills closer to their communities.
Okay, thanks for this. Now, I've actually, from the organizers, gotten a couple of questions from attendees. One of them is addressed to Marek, and let me just read it. So this is from the World Bank Global Energy Practice. So Marek, the question is, your presentation focused on renewable energy only. So this questioner would like to know a bit more if your model does this as well on the energy efficiency side. Does your model estimate the indirectly induced jobs as well, plus jobs from reinvestment in other sectors from money saved through energy savings in energy efficiency as part of the transition? Marek? Did I speak clearly enough? You heard the question?
The answer is yes. We at the International Labour Organization, we relied on the EAI, the International Energy Agency, which developed the long-term technology scenario, which you may know. It's a scenario which develops basically 4 types of technologies that are necessary to reach the Paris goal. So they developed a very detailed plan at world region level and even at country level for some of the major economies, which includes renewable energies by technology, which includes energy efficiency, which includes transport, and which includes construction. So in the model that I have shown, we developed at the global level, that included the 4 technology changes, or within each of the sector there were more technology changes that are necessary. And obviously energy efficiency is by the EAA is called the hidden fuel, because it basically increases productivity, increases labor productivity, increases capital productivity, because for the same output, you just put in less energy, and obviously it's highly beneficial to business and to everyone. So that is a saving that is then reinvested, and we use the propensities to spend by governments, households, and companies to then stimulate the economy, which is the type of induced effect that you have been asking about. Let me just try, if you allow, also address your first, of the other speakers' first highlight, the importance of engagement. Let me try to contradict a little bit, getting into the policy debate of the COVID response. You know? We see the stimulus packages that are adopted around the world, again, being silent on climate, being silent on renewable energy. Again, the question is why? Because they are driven by ministries of finance and ministries of economy who see the importance of getting the economy back on its feet, protecting jobs, including in airline industries, including in all type of fossil fuel-based industries. In China, you observe the contrary, investments into hard physical infrastructure, coal, and so forth will be increasing again. So the decision makers, it is all important to engage people on the ground. And we at the ILO, we are tripartite. We promote dialogue with workers and enterprises because that is of utmost importance. And we must also engage the public. However, decisions are taken by governments in finance and economy. And it is the positive out of the COVID crisis is in 2 weeks, the world was shut down. If governments want, they can. If we believe climate is an emergency, we can. We can, and that is a very positive message. But why are we not turning to these opportunities that Ivetta and is discussed in environmental circles? We are staying in environmental circles. We are engaging the public, and the public is happy with all the green stuff because we all believe. But then when it really hits, then ministers of finance, economy take a decision, everyone accepts it. And it's back to business as usual. And I'm afraid that after the crisis, we will see the same as after the financial crisis, we will hit CO2 emission increase again. And why? Because we are not talking and engaging the right people, which is ministers of finance and economy, to show them, look, we have an opportunity, but for this, we must assess those who lose out. We must see policies, just transition policies for those who lose out. And why not? And I think the Dennis may talk to it. The coal, the so-called coal phase-out plan is a good example. There are massive amounts to the coal industry. But as compared to the COVID crisis response that Germany just adopted, it's nothing. So why is it possible? Let's negotiate with the oil and gas producers and all the others if we can produce an agreement where yes they are compensated for it, but we agree to a transition. Now this is possible, and I do think that we must engage and think seriously on how out of our environmental circles we get into the real world, and the real world is people, yes, but the real world taking the decisions is ministers of finance and planning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Marek. I think it speaks, if nothing else, also to the need to not think in terms of stakeholders as sort of passive factors out there, but really also the ones who actually are on the input side. In a sense, maybe the drivers of many of these processes, of the scenario building, of the modeling, of the how do we decide on budget priorities, how do we decide on overall priorities, and how do we actually learn lessons from the Corona crisis that as you I think quite well said, are in a very fundamental way quite applicable to this other much larger crisis that we're facing with regard to climate. So thank you very much for that. We have, I think, only about 4 or 5 minutes. There are 2 more questions, one to Dennis, one to Ivetta, that came in. So if we can address them very, very briefly, I will read them after you. And let's do this quickly because we are being urged to finish this in 5 minutes, this session. So to Dennis. One of the main arguments that often comes from developing countries when it comes to the integration of variable renewable energy into power systems is that they jeopardize the safe and reliable operation of their power systems. Can we, or how can we demonstrate the opposite? You have some ideas on that?
Well, how can we demonstrate? Is just by taking steps into the right direction in terms of operational planning, assessing the infrastructure at hand, and also implementing. Power systems rely on system operators who know their job very well. For them, flexibilities, deviations from forecasts, etc., are nothing new. So they are capable of managing. They have been capable of managing these aspects in the past, and there's no evidence right now from jurisdictions which already have deployed significant amount of variable renewables in their system that system operators cannot also adapt their strategies and decisions to incorporate larger shares of renewables, also including into power systems which are less mature than most the power systems we see in OECD economies, which are fully developed, which at the moment for a long time haven't seen the need to be expanded because there was no growth in electricity demand. So the systems have been more stable, more meshed, most of them more interconnected. So they have just been stronger, but at the same time, there's good technical models, there's good engineers out there, not only in these countries, which if you let them do their job and give them the freedom to make the right decisions, I have no reason to assume that the lights will go out in some jurisdictions only because they deploy more renewables.
Okay, well, thanks for this. And sorry to jump right to the last question to Ivetta. So the question is there any way that LTES models can help emerging countries to find financial help to develop their NDCs? I'll try to just answer. I know it is an open-ended question, but try to maybe just come up with a quick response. We have a couple minutes and I have a final announcement before we close. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, I think it depends obviously on how well it is developed. There are dedicated kind of models which show the benefits of certain energy policies and certain fiscal policy like fossil fuel subsidy reform for emission reductions and for NDCs. So it's possible, but it requires extra work, and I hope more emerging countries will actually start doing this long-term planning.
Good, thank you very much. So I think we're all in due time. Thank you very much to Dennis, Ivetta, and Marek for their presentations and their answers to the questions. I think we were very time constrained, as probably is true for all the sessions. But I'm sure that you laid the seeds for a lot of very, very good thinking, and we should all make sure that we continue to think and act on these issues. So before I close, I've been asked to say that we now take a break of an hour. So the next session will resume at 2 p.m. Central European time. Again, thank you very much, and see you at the next session.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to IRENA for the great move online, if everyone responded to the COVID crisis the same way.
Well said. Thank you.